Crypto right now is like this adventurer who's finally found the X on the map. We've dug up the treasure chest, and the treasure we've been searching for a long time is right inside of the treasure chest. The only thing standing between us and this long awaited treasure of regulatory clarity is two parties: big crypto on one side, TradFi on the other, and the deadlock between them. If the only lock you want to see right now is the crypto markets locking on to some gains, or if you're finding value in these videos, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies DRep address and the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Okay, thank you for joining, everybody. Thank you for joining. Let's see who's here. We've got Hilldog is here. Let's fucking go. Let's go, Hilldog. Pucky Hawk is here. Pucky Hawk says, laugh out loud. Right now, I feel like we were just hurrying up to wait. We kind of are. Hilldog says, who isn't on the Epstein list? That's good. That's a good question. Glad to be here and early, says Nico. Thanks for all you do. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Let's go. Brown Beardo says, let's go. Mission Zambia is here. Good morning. Thanks for joining. Afro in the Wind is here. Let's go. Let's go. Ready? Let's go. Nico says, I'm home processing pork belly. Ooh, you're talking my language. Talking my language there with this pork belly, which I'll use next few weeks, and enjoying being part of the Army of Spies. Thank you for joining, Nico, and for making me very hungry. Frazik is here. Welcome. Welcome. Otis Frijo says, what's in the box? What's in the box? Let's go. Let's go. Brian Packard, good evening. Blue Mammal says, good evening from California. Thanks for joining, Blue Mammal. Severed Tom Cardiac says, cheers all. Let's fucking go. Jay Marie says, yo, 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 gonna do some shrooms. Let's go. Let's go, Jay Marie. Omar Wright is here. Greetings. Thanks for joining. 8 Eclipse is here. Let's go. Okay, Mission Zambia says it slipped the whole intro for Mission Zambia. Started with okay. Oh, skipped the whole intro. Started with okay. Okay, good to know. Thanks for letting me know. CryptoX Surfer says Donald Trump is not on the Epstein list. Haha, just kidding. Laugh out loud. Afro in the Wind says, come on, what's in the box? Okay, let's talk about what is in the box. Pucky Hawk would like to join. Jay Marie. Okay, let's talk about what's in the box, though. What is in the box is regulatory clarity for crypto. We sort of followed the map. We followed the map since 2009. We finally found the X on the old pirate map. On the beach, we dug down in the sand. We found the treasure chest containing regulatory clarity. You know, I think about a year ago. I feel like we dug up the treasure chest about a year ago. Oh, 8 Eclipse says same, no intro. Okay, good to know. That's good to know. Okay. I don't know why that was tonight. Hilldog says, yep. Obviously, everybody's referencing the movie Seven. It is not a severed head in the box in our case. It is regulatory clarity. So about a year ago, I feel like we were at the spot. We dug up the treasure chest and we were like, okay, this is pretty easy. We have this very pro-crypto administration. We seem to have enough Congress people in both the House and the Senate. The legislature seems willing to pass regulatory clarity for us. This should be easy. We got it through the House. Again, easy. Rulo, hola. Rulo says, in dust we trust. Sounds good. I like the ring of that. Sounds good. It seemed like things would be easy, and it went easy through the House. Then we got to the Senate. Otis Frichov says, you know, that's fair because our deadlock is technically a severed head. One without the tissues, just the bone, but still that qualifies as a severed head. So you're not wrong on that front, my friend. We got to the Senate, and what we're seeing now is deadlock. Unfortunately, it's a little bit of a deadlock of, I'll use the word our, O-U-R, our own making. When I say it's of our own making, I'm counting crypto as a whole, unfortunately. And I've been trying to make the case for about the last month that we need to start thinking about crypto, not in terms of crypto being one huge monolithic thing where everyone in crypto's interests are always aligned. We are now to the point where the interests of what I'll call big crypto have diverged from the interests of all of us normal people in crypto. Because at this point, we've got these entities, the big exchanges, Coinbase, Kraken, all the rest, A16Z. They've all got a vested interest in crypto. They're certainly a part of crypto in their own way, but they are very interested in things like stablecoin yield. Stablecoin yield. And I think what all of us retail people in crypto are most interested in, sure, I would love to have stablecoin yield. It's actually better for consumers. Eventually, it has to go in that direction. But what I'm most interested in right now is what we can call token taxonomy. I think calling all of crypto tokens sort of diminishes what crypto is. I'm going to call it coin taxonomy instead, because as much as the Bitcoiners would like to say that all of the altcoins are actually just tokens, they're fucking coins. They're coins. That's why we call them altcoins. So I'm going to call it coin taxonomy. But coin taxonomy is what we need. We need that distinction between commodities and securities. We want to throw all the scammers into SEC world. We want to throw them into the SEC pit. And there's this giant beast down there that's going to devour them if they try to fuck the consumers. That's what we want to do with them. We want to throw them down into the pit, and they can fight the beast. And the beast is going to make sure, the beast being the SEC, is going to make sure they don't fuck the consumers. Us, basically, right? Retail, us. We don't want to be fucked by those guys anymore. So we're going to throw them into the pit. But the rest of crypto doing legit shit like Cardano, like the rest of the, good base layer coins and everybody else sort of following the rules and not trying to fuck the consumers. The rest of us will live in commodities world. And, this might involve, certain schemes where you start out and you're like going to fall into the pit. And then you prove that you're not going to do anything to fuck the consumer. And, maybe you don't have to fall into the pit. Maybe you're just sort of on this gangplank and you're walking the plank. And then you prove you're not going to do any of those bad things. And you get to stay in commodities world. You don't get thrown down in the pit with the beast. This is probably the best we can do in the short term. The problem is we're running this deadlock where Coinbase and the rest, I'm not trying to pick on Coinbase, but let's face it, they're the most high profile example. They're trying to get in this big fight over stablecoin yield, saying things like no bill is better than a bad bill. But what we need right now is the coin taxonomy thing. This is sort of like, we don't need to march all the way to the enemy's castle and take over their castle. If we just push the enemy back into their own territory, that's enough for this year, right? Let's just push the enemy invader army back into their own territory. This year, we'll go conquer their castle at a later date, right? Let's just save all the peasants in our kingdom. Let's push the invaders out of our kingdom this year. We'll worry about going on the offensive and taking the enemy castle, the enemy fortress at a later date. Coinbase, we all know you're going to storm the enemy castle at some point down the road. We're behind you. It is actually better for everybody if you do that. If you get stablecoin yield, it's better for the consumer, no question, and it's going to happen. But can we chill with that for this year and just get the goddamn coin taxonomy thing? Like, if you can pull it off, Coinbase, we're all going to be happy. If you can pull this off in the next month or so, we're all going to be happy. But right now, we're staring down the barrel of deadlock. We've got deadlock. And if we don't get this shit passed before midterms, maybe we don't get it passed till like 2029. That's not acceptable. That is too high a price to get what you want, Coinbase, which is stablecoin yield. So let's talk a little bit about some of the parameters of this and what's going on. And I'm going to explain why I think the stablecoin yield thing, it is the right thing for everybody, consumers, for crypto, bank consumers, crypto retail, bank retail, just all people using financial services. it would be better, but I'm going to talk about maybe why that's a little too ambitious for this year. Let's take the win. Let's get the coin taxonomy. Let's take the win. God damn it. Raz says, are we sure it's not Davy Jones' heart in the lockbox? No, it's definitely regulatory clarity. I will, I will fully reject crypto if the Senate passes a bill that is just a drawing of Davy Jones's heart or something like that. Brian Packard says he hit the like button. Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. Dolph B. Wolf, good morning. Thanks for joining. Hilldog, any concern clarity is really captured by the banks? So no, I think what the banks care about is the stablecoin yield thing, and it is if a bill were passed that said, crypto entities can never offer stablecoin yield, you could call that captured by the banks. If coin taxonomy was passed with no mention of stablecoin yield, then it just doesn't address stablecoin yield. I think that would be fine. That's what we should shoot for. That's all this ever should have been. The stablecoin yield thing, nobody was talking about that. I mean, Coinbase was talking about it. Kraken was maybe talking about it. A16Z, I'm sure, was talking about it. Were any of us? Hell no. We don't care. I mean, we care, but the thing we really care about is the coin taxonomy thing. So while I think there's a version of stablecoin language that could certainly qualify as basically legislative and regulatory capture by TradFi, I would prefer a bill that just doesn't mention it, just doesn't talk about it. So I don't think that's what we care about this year. I don't think that's the primary concern. And so let's get into it. Let's talk about where we're at and a little bit about why I think the stablecoin thing doesn't matter as much, right? So I've sort of been waiting for this. So this little clip made the rounds, yesterday and today on X. There's Jay Coco. Thanks for joining, Jay Coco. Jay Coco says, AOS and community, hit the like and let's get this bill done. Yes, please. For God's sakes, let's get the bill done. Please, please, please. So I've been waiting for this. So as soon as it became apparent that TradFi and Coinbase were going to be fighting with each other, I knew that the White House was going to do two things. They were going to put pressure on TradFi and they were going to put pressure on Coinbase. So we almost immediately saw Trump threatening a lawsuit against JP Morgan Chase for debanking him, right? Operation Choke Point 2.0. It's easy to forget he and his family were also victims of Operation Choke Point 2.0. So immediately after it was apparent that TradFi was not going to cooperate with this bill, they were not going to compromise, they were not going to give an inch, we saw that lawsuit being threatened. And then we knew the next foot that was going to drop, the next shoe that was going to drop was going to be pressure on Coinbase. And we've seen a few people mention it, but it's a little bit of a different thing to see the Secretary of the goddamn Treasury go on Fox News and basically, without naming you, label you as recalcitrant. So this is an interview Scott Bessent did with Maria Bartiromo, and he basically said, hey, we got to get the Clarity Act passed. I'm optimistic. He used every politician's favorite term when they're asked, how likely is this to pass? They never say likely, very likely, unlikely. They just say, I'm optimistic, right? They're like, I'm thinking positively about that question, right? Which doesn't tell you a lot about its actual chances, but tells you what they would prefer. Obviously, he would prefer for it to be passed. But he said part of the problem is that you've got certain recalcitrant actors saying things like no bill is better than a bad bill, right? What the White House obviously wants is a compromise. And that compromise is probably something that Coinbase is going to call a bad bill and JP Morgan Chase is going to call a bad bill. All of TradFi is going to call it a bad bill if there's any way for Coinbase to offer yield. And Coinbase is going to call it a bad bill if there's not a way for them to offer passive yield, right? The compromise is sort of going in a certain direction, and it has to do with yield on activity. What they do not want, what TradFi really, really does not want, is passive yield on stablecoins. Why? Because then their deposit business is screwed. as we've discussed. Troll Toll is here. Hello. Thank you for joining. CryptoX Server says, I feel like some of the elite crypto bros are behind the psyops, like the phantom insider manipulation, Solana market makers, bot extractions, and Binance liquidity dumps. Can Clarity Act fix this? So I think Clarity Act is sort of the frame setting. The problem is without coin taxonomy, we don't even know legally, we don't have a definition of what is a security and what is a commodity, right? We tried for years to use, sort of the old securities law framework for deciding what's a security. It's just very ill-fitting for crypto. We did the Howey analysis a billion times on this channel in a billion different contexts. It's just very ill-fitting, right? And it's very archaic. It's very old. So we need to frame out what are commodities, what are securities, and then you can start applying, commodities laws about commodities manipulation and laws about securities manipulation, right? Because under the securities law, a lot of these things would require disclosure. And right now, nobody even knows what's a security and what's a commodity. So you can't really apply the same laws around disclosure. And without disclosure, you have a lot of fuckery. So do I think this can help with the fuckery? Definitely, because we need to frame out first what's what, and then you can apply the laws in those various arenas. But first, that's how we get rid of the fuckery. But first, we need to decide what's what. Okay, Otis Fricho says, if we can get clarity, then utility can grow and adoption should explode. I hope so. That's the hope. What if this is a theater play to steer the timing for institutional accumulation? I mean, yeah. I mean, if there are TradFi entities that want to continue accumulating before we have regulatory clarity, in the hopes that keeps the price low before we have regulatory clarity and it could take off. Does that mean they're going to drag their feet? For sure they're going to drag their feet if they're still trying to accumulate. If they're like, oh my god, if their view is, and I'm not saying it is, but if their view is that things are going to skyrocket as soon as we have regulatory clarity, then if they're trying to accumulate, then of course they're going to be more than happy to drag their feet. Yeah, it looks like Otis Frichov agrees with that. Frazik says, yield on stable coins, I understand. It is huge. What does taxonomy do for crypto? We just covered that. I know you probably made that comment before I just described that, but just the fact that banks are involved in the decision-making shows who the country is being run by. Fair point. I'm definitely not the person who's ever going to argue about the inappropriate role of TradFi in U.S. policymaking. I'm not the guy who's going to argue against that. Let's go. The Joey says, let's go. Thanks for your terrific content and insight. Thank you for saying that. The Joey, I appreciate you saying that very much. Thanks for saying that. So this is the White House doing its deal-making thing where it just starts putting pressure on both sides. It starts making things unpleasant for both sides. Calling Coinbase recalcitrant is very smart because you're not like outright insulting them as being sort of malignantly intended, right? You're not saying their intent is like malignant. You're saying like they're just being recalcitrant, right? This is a good way to label Coinbase. Make them seem like they're not being cooperative, like they're being stubborn, like they're demanding things that they have no right to demand. This is the right way to label Coinbase if you're the White House administration. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I understand what they're doing here. They're trying to put pressure so that both sides will be willing to compromise. And if they continue to be unwilling to compromise, you just up the rhetoric and start calling them worse and worse names. So right now it's like the Secretary of the Treasury, soon it'll be Trump, like talking about Brian Armstrong's bald head. It'll be like Trump making fun of Brian Armstrong, shit like that pretty soon if they don't make progress. So what did happen today? Today, we first saw this. The White House will host representatives from the banking and crypto industries this afternoon at 2:30 p.m. Eastern For the second meeting, the second iteration of the stablecoin yield negotiations. See, people aren't even pretending like this is about what the bulk of the bill is actually about. Everybody knows this is just about stablecoin yield. So you've got Goldman, JP Morgan, B of A, Wells, Citi, PNC, US Bank, along with some trade associations. Then you've got Paul Graywall of Coinbase, A16Z's there, blockchain associations there, Stuart Alderodi of Ripple's there. They're, all the usual characters are here, and they're just going to talk about stablecoin yield. Everybody knows that's what this is really about. It's not even about the whole coin talk taxonomy thing. Everybody knows it's just about this one issue that affects big crypto and TradFi and doesn't really affect us as much. According to sources familiar with matter, attendees received an email emphasizing the need to come prepared with serious proposals and a willingness to compromise. So again, everybody knew, everybody was aware. This wasn't like a single source thing. Everybody's aware. Need to come prepared with serious proposals and a willingness to compromise. So people got real excited. Here you saw accounts posting things like this. Clarity coming in hours. I think most of us who follow this closely sort of laughed when we saw these kind of posts. It's like clarity coming in hours, fire, like Donald Trump is going to get up at the end of the meeting and declare regulatory clarity has arrived. I think most of us who follow this knew that was actually not going to happen. So what did we get? As soon as the meeting ended, we saw posts like this. Exclusive White House crypto meeting ended. No deal on stablecoin yield yet. Banks versus industry still deadlocked. Talks called constructive. That's what they said last time. Final deadline. So here's the important part. Final deadline, end of February for Clarity Act progress. Stay tuned. So the problem is, I think we have two parties. It's going to be hard to thread the needle, right? It's possible the White House is just going to have to pick a winner. The White House might have to pick a winner and say, hey, we're going to throw all of our weight more toward the Coinbase position or more toward the TradFi position. And that's going to be tempered by how much money, how much lobbying money those two sides can sort of spread around Congress. And that's the only reason why they both have a seat at the table. The reason why both sides of this have a seat at the table is because they both have a certain amount of lobbying power. They can spread enough money around Washington to get votes to make things pass or not pass. That's the only reason they're the ones at the table. It's not because the White House fucking loves Brian Armstrong or loves Jamie Dimon. Trump is threatening to sue Jamie Dimon, right? But they know to get it through Congress, they have to get these guys to agree to it. Otherwise, these guys will go to Congress and spread enough money around to make it not pass. That's the problem. So here's a little bit more detailed rundown. People on both sides called the meeting productive, but again, no compromise was reached by the end of the meeting. However, deal specifics were discussed in more detail today. For example, banks and the banking trades came prepared with a written set of prohibition principles in the pic below, which detailed what they are willing and not willing to compromise on when it comes to stablecoin rewards. You can tell these pricks still think they are the masters of the universe. The banks and the banking trade associations came prepared with a written set of prohibition principles. So they're laying out the laws. The bankers actually came with their own written set of laws here. One source pointed out a key concession from the banks being the any proposed exemption language in paragraph 2, because they were previously unwilling to discuss any exemptions with respect to offering rewards on a transaction-based basis at all. So they did get the memo. They did understand they had to make some compromise, and the compromise was this. So Stuart Alderodi, who you probably remember from all of the Ripple litigation against the SEC, said compromises in the air. There was heavy focus on so-called permissible activities. What kinds of account activity could be allowed in order for crypto firms to offer rewards? Crypto wants definitions on this to be broad. Banks want it to be narrow. We know that. We understand that. For next steps, further discussions between the present parties are expected to happen in the coming days, but it's unclear whether another meeting of the scale will take place before the end of the month. That's probably not good because we're only a third of the way through the month. That means for the next 2/3 of the month, we get nothing, and there's some kind of a deadline at the end of the month. The White House urged both parties to reach a deal by March 1st. This meeting was smaller, and she again lists the parties in the room. She mentioned some additional groups, Paxos, and this is let's see, this is the CEO. I believe he's the CEO of the Crypto Council. He was at Wilkie. Yeah, G Kim, CEO of Crypto Council, formerly of Gemini, Kraken, and Wilkie-var. Okay, so what did they bring? What did the banks bring to the table? So we've known all along this is what they wanted. No person may provide any form of financial or non-financial consideration to a stablecoin holder in connection with the purchase, use, ownership, possession. So basically no passive yield. Any proposed exemption from the prohibition, so any yield that is allowed, must be extremely limited in scope so as not to undermine the prohibition. It must not drive deposit flight. So, I mean, this is why this is such a deadlock. What they don't want, they're asking for a sort of drafting principle that says you can't draft anything in this bill that would result in deposit flight. That means people taking their fucking money out of the bank and putting it in Coinbase. That's exactly what crypto was made for, right? Crypto was made to disintermediate the banks. And the banks are like, okay, we'll only agree to this crypto law if you agree it won't do the one thing that crypto was actually made for. So this is why this is a bit of an impasse, and why I think we need to just kick the invaders out of our kingdom and storm their castle next year or the year after or the year after, something like that. But let's get what we can. Let's take the easy win. We've sort of already got the easy win. Let's collect our gains now. Let's take the easy win and we'll storm the castle later, right? So I agree with all of you. I think a lot of you are saying like, fuck the banks. Yeah, Frazek right here. I'm with Coinbase. Fuck the banks and the US government too. Who are they to decide we don't deserve yield? I agree. I 100% agree. Crypto Gypsy says, let's go. But I agree. But also, am I willing to sacrifice coin taxonomy for it? Hell no. Hell no. I'll take coin taxonomy. I'm still worried about restrictions in DeFi and dApps preventing innovation in the space. Yeah, I mean, we don't get any of that. If this stablecoin yield issue prevents the bill entirely, we don't even get to the point of being able to worry about the things you're talking about. Serious question. If exchanges receive yield on stables, can foreign entities copy, then legally extract USD yield from the US without bank level regulation? So, okay. Can foreign entities copy, then legally? It depends on what you mean by copy. Like if you're saying, could a foreign entity hold those stable coins and collect the same yield that a normal US holder could? Of course, right? It's like the US is pretty open for business when it comes to foreign investors. The US is pretty open for business. Obviously, if you're North Korean, you're not allowed. If you're from certain other sanctioned geographies, you're not allowed. But most of the world can do business in the US. We collect a lot of taxes. We collect more than our fair share of taxes, that's for sure, the way our taxes work. But if you're saying, could a foreign entity create its own stablecoin pegged to USD? It already exists. It already happens, right? There are already stable coins. We know this because the very first stable coin obviously was created, theoretically, legally outside the US. That being Tether, which historically we associate with the people related to the Bitfinex exchange and some other people. But yeah, I mean, the original stablecoin was issued by a foreign issuer. So, and it was pegged to the USD. Exchanges need to separate themselves from Chase, be our own. Yep, I agree. Be competition. I agree with all that. Yep. It almost sounds like a form of bank bailout. I like you applying that label to it, right? Because it's a preemptive bank bailout. Because the banks are fucked if this deposit flight were to occur, and surely it would, right? if Coinbase is offering 3.5, Chase is not going to be competitive at 0, right? 0.2 or whatever, 0.02 or whatever, you know, whatever Chase is offering between 0 and 0.5%. Crypto was made for enabling liberty and freedom for all. Agree. There is no reason to let JP Morgan be king. True, but I don't know if we can get it through Congress. The problem is I don't know if Congress will pass the bill. So that is the problem. Is it wrong and corrupt? Yes. Is it reality? Also probably yes. It looks like we may not be able to get this thing through. I mean, the reason the White House has TradFi at the negotiating table is because they can't get it through Congress without TradFi agreeing to it. That's how strong a hold Wall Street has on the legislative branch of the government. That's just the reality of it, sadly. And there's not a lot we can do about it from the crypto world. So for now, but I think what we need to do is get the coin taxonomy thing. We'll get stablecoin yield eventually. Can we get it if we demand it this year? We might sacrifice coin taxonomy and not get coin taxonomy until like 2029, because there's a very strong possibility that the more pro crypto party loses at least one of the two houses of Congress. So, yeah, pretty much that's what we're looking at. Unfortunately, it's a very rich bully who can buy Congress people. So this is what we're dealing with right now, guys. This is where it's at. So simultaneously, though, TradFi is also interested in holding crypto themselves. While they don't want crypto to offer yield on stablecoins, they're more than happy to hold crypto. Here we see that Goldman Sachs has revealed it has 1.1 billion USD in Bitcoin, 1 billion USD in ETH, 153 million XRP, and 108 million in Solana. So this is very interesting. And of course, CEO David Solomon is scheduled to speak at World Liberty Fi Forum in Palm Beach next week. So it's like, great, go ahead and speak at, I guess, the conference of, like basically the worst crypto ecosystem. Okay, it's not really the worst, but maybe not my favorite. Coinbase, and that has nothing to do with, who's behind it. It's just the way that ecosystem, monetized itself. Coinbase is not doing everything the banks are doing, but banks can do everything Coinbase is doing, right? True. That's the situation they want. What they want, and I mean, they kind of have the legal upper hand on that, because what they were telling Brian Armstrong of Coinbase in Davos repeatedly was, hey, if you want to do what banks do, which is offer yield on passive deposits, become a bank, right? Coinbase could go that road. Caitlin Long of Wyoming Speedy Bank fame would tell him how hard it is, and not to do that, of course. But their refrain is, if you want to do bank things, become a bank. So they've kind of got the upper hand on that one. And what crypto is asking for right now is to be able to do this bank thing without being a bank, basically. So, and I mean, that's what we want. That's what crypto was made for, to do bank things without being a bank, including central bank things, which we're already doing. Who has larger influence in the US government, Israel or central banks? Ooh, I mean, well, as far as finance goes, it's not even central banks. It's more just like, it's more like commercial banks, right? So, as far as this kind of economic policy goes, definitely commercial banks, right? So also simultaneously, this is going on. US dollar testing 15-year support. It's now or never. But remember, people are kind of trying to freak out about this. This poster down below here makes a very good point about this, though. This is exactly what the Trump administration has been trying to do, saying they were trying to do for a long time. Trump in 2024 with Bloomberg, we have a big currency problem because the depth of the currency now in terms of strong dollar, weak yen, weak yuan is massive. So going back, clear back to this post from 2024. This was an interview that Trump gave. We have a big currency problem. This is the first thing he mentioned when asked about his views on the economy. We have a big currency problem. And remember, this is July 2024. So a year ago, last summer. We have a big currency problem. Let's see. The current levels of the yen and the yuan versus USD are described as unbelievable. And he goes through all the economic problems. But it's been obvious for a while that Trump wanted to weaken the US dollar. What does that do? That makes US exports more competitive on the global market versus these other currencies that are weaker. We talked about this yesterday also. How a weakening dollar could create that scenario laid out in that post that talked about what happened decades ago with the Japanese economy, but in 2026 with the Chinese economy. So go back and watch that video. If you haven't seen that one, we lay out the whole scenario there. One theory, maybe right, maybe wrong, but interesting. We are now at 15-year support for the US dollar. Okay. Mr. Beast bought a bank. Coinbase should be able to do the same. Yeah, what was the bank called that Mr. Beast bought? The bank is called, the name is escaping me now. Is it really a full-on bank though? I mean, does it have like a Fed master account or is it just a fintech platform? That's my question. The White House needs to call out the banks more instead of attacking exchanges. So, I mean, Trump is threatening to sue JP Morgan Chase. So that's pretty aggressive, right? The president threatening to sue one of the biggest banks in the world, pretty aggressive. That's pretty aggressive. I'm glad he is. I'm not second guessing that. I'm glad he is, but pretty aggressive. Okay, so let's talk for a second. I thought this was a very interesting post from one of our Japanese friends, a member of the Japanese Cardano community. I thought this was a very interesting post because there's an interesting question. There's an interesting question that has always sort of, I don't even want to say it's plagued the Cardano ecosystem, but it's always been a thing in the Cardano ecosystem. Why isn't Cardano DeFi attractive? And people have a lot of weird explanations of this. They say things like, Ethereum, the EVM world, account balance world had first mover advantage, a lot of things like that. But really, my explanation has always been the lockups in DeFi are less attractive in Cardano because we have self-custodied staking. Self-custodied staking is pretty attractive. It makes DeFi a lot less attractive. In ecosystems like Ethereum, you have slashing. So there's that added risk in staking in Ethereum. Makes DeFi a little bit more attractive. So here's this Japanese investor's take on this. The Japanese Cardano community has been staking for years with wallets like Daedalus and Yoroi. I've been staking ADA the whole time. And when DeFi appeared on Cardano, I was honestly too cautious to use it. ADA staking isn't locked. It's non-custodial and you keep full ownership. Because of that, even when DeFi yields look attractive, I didn't feel a reason to use it. It's ironic. ADA staking is so attractive that when new dApps show up, the urge to try this dApp or do something with ADA doesn't really kick in. That's how I feel. And I think the Japanese community overall is similar. From a Japanese holder's perspective, right now, it often feels like returns from ADA staking are better than attractive dApps and experiences that make you want to use ADA in daily life. Until that balance flips, the motivations to say, I want to do something with ADA tends to stay low. As for you'll be able to pay with ADA, I have to be honest, that doesn't feel very compelling. In Japan, cash and credit cards already cover daily spending, and whether crypto becomes a normal payment tool is a broader question, not just ADA. On top of that, under Japanese tax rules, you guessed it, he's going to talk about the lack of a de minimis exemption in Japan. On top of that, under Japanese tax rules, you're taxed on the gain every time you use it for payment. So the incentive to actually buy things with ADA is weak. I'm not a developer, so I can only share this kind of feedback. I wrote this hoping it might be useful in some small way for dApp development. That's exactly why I believe that when more dApps deliver experiences that make people genuinely want to do something with ADA, Japanese holders will start to move. I'm looking forward to those products and rooting for your success. So I think this is really interesting. And this is not just, I think this doesn't just apply to Japanese Cardano holders. I think this applies to all Cardano holders. So Adam Dean also had a good comment down here. He said, like Charles said throughout the tour, he's talking about the tour, the midnight tour of Japan, Cardano dApps must do something different from every other app out there and provide a real compelling reason to use them. It's not enough just to copy the success from elsewhere. We must differentiate. The original poster says, totally agree with so many great dApps on Ethereum and Solana. Apps need to clear why Cardano from day one, not just a copy of what already works elsewhere. So I thought this was very interesting, and I think this is true. And it brings up the question of stable coins. So obviously, stable coins solve this de minimis tax exemption problem to some extent, right? Because obviously, if you're using a stable coin, then you don't have gains versus your native currency. Obviously, if you're in the US, then a USD pegged stablecoin fixes that. A little bit different if your native currency is Japanese yen, because then you're going to have Forex fluctuation between the yen and the dollar, like we just saw in that last chart. But stablecoins can fix this if you have a stablecoin pegged to your native currency, right? But it's like you may only want to use stablecoins for certain things in DeFi, right? I don't think stablecoins can fix the de minimis tax issue, but it doesn't fix it for using our actual base layer currency of ADA. So I think this is kind of interesting. Dolphy Wolf says, was Mr. Beast's bank called Monsters Inc.? I think that's the question you're answering. Does the nomination of Kevin Warsh seem bizarre to anyone else? Is he a sheep in wolf's clothes? That's what we talked about last night. Last night I talked about Kevin Warsh quite a bit. Yeah, it's bizarre. That's kind of the whole question I tried to address last night. It is bizarre because Kevin Warsh not in favor of quantitative easing. This is the opposite of what we expected. United States versus JPM Chase. Yep. Lobster traps. Yep. A big reason. Lobster traps are a lot less attractive in Cardano because we don't have slashing. Base layer proof of stake staking has not been a lobster trap. It's not a lobster trap. There's no trappiness to it. So it's much harder for us Cardano people to want to put our little lobster ADAs in a lobster trap. Mr. Beast's bank Evolve does not have a master account. Okay, so it's not what we would call a full commercial bank. It's going to be more like, I don't know if that means it's got a so-called skinny Fed account, but if it doesn't have that, then it's probably more of a platform than really a bank. Funny how the DOJ labels Bitcoin as dark money while gold is a commodity also. Both are traceable. Yep. Yep. Kwong, what do you like about ADA? Go back and watch the last 794 videos. That is my long explanation of what I like about ADA. It's a lot of hours of video. Maybe Coinbase could partner with a bank. They could, and banks would love that. Banks would love that if JP Morgan could rebrand itself as JP Morgan Base. Base Morgan Base, JP Morgan Base. JP Morgan Base. There you go. JP Morgan Base. JP Morgan would love to become JP Morgan Base, but that would entail Jamie Dimon being the CEO and Brian Armstrong and the rest of the crew going away. So that would not be a very crypto thing to happen. If that happened, that would be a dagger in the heart of crypto, I'm afraid. Sub-Zero's here. Yo. Hello from deep in the mines. Thank you for joining from deep in the mines. I will probably, at some point soon, I will also be deep in the mines, sadly. So Chase Base. Ooh, Cardano World. Yep, Chase Base. It would be Chase. It's all horrible. I mean, it all sounds horrible to my ears, certainly. So here's something else though. Okay, so this is why I think this is a good this is a good, concise explanation of why DeFi doesn't get used very much in Cardano. This is exactly the same as my thesis around this question. Here's something else. Here's something related. So this is obviously not a Cardano person. This is somebody from the Zcash world who's sort of talking about, the rest of mainstream crypto, not talking about Cardano, but they have something interesting to say. There is no reason to use DeFi unless you have longs on cryptocurrencies and want access to financial services while preserving self-custody. This is why and how DeFi got bootstrapped, and all the other applications are cargo cults. In before my USDC yield, that's not DeFi. So this is a very good point. We talk about DeFi like it's the end all be all of crypto. Like, if it's not DeFi, it's not really crypto. But at the same time, simultaneously, we're all being told we should really care about USDC yield. Because let's face it, when Coinbase says stablecoin yield, what they really mean is USDC yield, because that's the stablecoin they're in on. But USDC is not decentralized. Full stop, right? USDC is not a decentralized product. That is an asset-backed product. By definition, it's centralized. It is not decentralized. That is a centralized asset, right? This is something that people have conveniently forgotten, right? Crypto is about decentralized assets, decentralized ledgers. USDC is this thing that's this appendage that's been tacked on to crypto. It is not decentralized. So if you're talking about USDC yield, you're really talking about yield on an asset that's tied to fiat accounts, right? Centralized fiat accounts. It's asset backed, right? You've basically got the equivalent of fiat accounts, because famously they've been arguing with the TradFi institutions saying that they don't need to be FDIC insured because they're not not doing the same kind of fractional reserve banking as TradFi. That's because they're one-to-one backed, right? That means it's not decentralized. We're not talking about algorithmic stablecoins here. So he goes on, the non-ETH chains with DeFi will never have the same success because the primordial soup is fundamentally different. The VC investors use institutional custodians. USDC has institutional custodians, whereas the early ETH depositors to DeFi were ideologically committed to self-custody. This is the thing. The reason why DeFi made sense at its inception was it allowed you to do financial services, finance things, and still maintain self-custody. I saw this firsthand. The wells of the chain this person worked on were structurally unable to lock value anywhere, which radically contrasts with the savvy early ETH holders who bought their ETH from the ICO using Bitcoin. So even Vitalik jumped in to comment on this. He says, he talks about algorithmic stablecoins. So Vitalik instantly understood the importance of this, because Vitalik is like, well, wait a second, there are algorithmic stablecoins too. That's because he knows there's not a good argument with asset-backed stablecoins like USDC. They're not decentralized, right? What we're talking about is a centralized institution, Coinbase, being able to offer yield on a centralized asset, USDC, right? We talk about stablecoins like they're of us, like they're decentralized. They are not. They are not. This is a centralized product we have grafted onto crypto, much, kind of like grafting, grafting a branch from one fruit tree onto a different fruit tree. It's not really a part of that original fruit tree. We've just grafted it on. Maybe Brian Armstrong can scratch Jamie Dimon's back and Jamie will give him a massage, basically. Yeah, chase base. But Vitalik's making the point here. He says, in my opinion, no. Would algorithmic stablecoins fall into this? No. But we're not talking about algorithmic stablecoins. The kinds of yield that are being debated now are not algorithmic stablecoin yields. They are these centralized stablecoin yields, right? So this person understands the important part here, right? DeFi. So DeFi does solve the de minimis tax problem for day-to-day transactions. But it's like, why would you use DeFi if you're trying to get around the de minimis tax thing and you're using USDC, or in the case of Cardano, USDCX? Why would you use USDCX with DeFi when you could just use dollars on regular TradFi rails? So the advantage of using crypto is decentralization. But if you're already using a centralized asset anyway, aren't you just creating this like mimicry of the TradFi system? Are you really doing anything by using decentralized rails if the asset is centralized and KYC'd and all those things anyways? Because I mean, let's face it, the big advantage of DeFi to a lot of people, the big advantage of the decentralization, no debate, the advantage was the decentralization. But what it accomplished for people to a large extent was just regulatory arbitrage, right? There was this gray area for DeFi. You could do stuff in DeFi that you couldn't do on TradFi rails, right? On TradFi rails, you had to be KYC'd, somebody's going to have a copy of your passport or your driver's license. They're going to know what accounts you hold at what bank, where your money's going, all those things. The advantage of DeFi was that none of those things applied, right? But with USDC, that's a centralized entity, right? It's like good luck buying USDC on Coinbase or using any kind of an off ramp or on ramp from USDC without doing those things like KYC. So it's like this poster isn't quite saying the important part here, this original poster, and that's that the advantage of DeFi was that it was decentralized, and you lose that advantage when you're using a centralized asset, right? There are reasons we want to use centralized assets, but they, none of them have to do with decentralization, really, right? The reason we want centralized assets is as like a bridge to the TradFi world, right? It's not decentralized. You lose the advantages of decentralization when you're using an asset that is centralized. That's the part that I think a lot of people are forgetting. Like even inside Cardano, we've talked about this, how, stable coins are probably not going to be the cure-all that people think they're going to be. Getting USDCX, a good thing for sure, depending on how it works, as long as it's seamless, as long as you can like deposit dollars in Coinbase, buy USDCX, and send it to your Cardano wallet. That'll be good. But is it going to be this huge boon for Cardano DeFi? That part is hasn't been established yet. I'll put it that way. That part hasn't been established yet. Matt says, "What's up?" So this is something to think about. This guy's pointing out the fact that decentralization makes sense if the assets are also decentralized, but decentralization doesn't necessarily make sense if you're using a centralized asset where all of the regulatory requirements already apply, right? It's like people aren't using decentralized rails for the hell of it. That's a small percentage of us. Like, sure, probably everybody listening to this channel is like a decentralization enthusiast. We're a small percentage of the overall users of any financial services sector, right? And a lot of the people are only going to use the decentralized version if there's some advantage to it. They're not just sort of philosophically inclined toward it. There has to be like a real advantage. And all of the regulatory advantage to it goes away if the asset is centralized, right? I mean, if you're ever going to touch USDC, if you're ever going to change from USDCX to USDC and then USDC to actual dollars, right? If you're ever going to use an off ramp, it's like, good luck. So anyways, I think this is something that's overlooked, and probably this won't occur to people until it's here. Probably in the Cardano ecosystem, people won't really understand all of this until USDCX is on the ground. And then people are still going to be asking the question like, wait a second, how come, DeFi platforms aren't, rocketing to the moon? That's when people will realize what this guy's pointing out right here, and what Vitalik is conveniently brushing under the rug by only talking about algorithmic stablecoins, which is super funny because the whole thing is about USDC. He mentions USDC in his post, and Vitalik's like, but what about algorithmic stablecoins? Because he knows that USDC is a different story. He says, though, of course, current put USDC into Aave gadgets. This is Vitalik now. Vitamin says, though, of course, current put USDC into Aave gadgets do not qualify under either of my categories. His two categories are sort of like the easy answer to our algorithmic stablecoins, genuine DeFi, and our algorithmic stablecoins backed by real world assets, genuine DeFi. He says putting USDC into Aave isn't DeFi basically here. He's saying that's not DeFi, and that's the point of this original poster. So anyways, I think people aren't going to understand this until they see it firsthand in Cardano. Charles Hoskinson featured in the largest newspaper in Hokkaido, online and in print. That's great news. That's great news. I'm glad he's getting some publicity over there. The advantage of a centralized stablecoin is that you can get high yield via bonds, etc. Decentralization comes with a lot of challenges. Not if the banks have anything to do with it. The banks are going to, depending on how the bill's written, I mean, what's being debated right now is yield on stablecoins. So decentralization comes with a lot of challenges. There is no supporting infrastructure for DeFi at the moment. Yeah, agreed. I mean, it's like, whether or not it actually works once regulations come in is a question, right? How much promise DeFi still has after regulations come in is a question. And of course, that depends on what regulations come in. So it's like, right now they're debating what kinds of activities can produce yield with stablecoins, right? The scenario you're describing, maybe it will, maybe it won't. Depends on who wins the negotiation, right? Remember when Fox Business Maria Bartiromo interviewed Charles way back? Yep, we actually talked about her earlier today. She did, earlier in the video today, we talked about an interview she did with Scott Bessent. But I do remember that. Charles did a couple of interviews with her, and they were pretty good. She and he worked pretty well on camera together, I think. So here's something else interesting. So Chamath Palihapitiya, people have strong feelings about Chamath now because of his activities on the podcast. I thought some of his earlier stuff before the podcast was kind of brilliant. People soured on him a little bit when he had the kind of glib, like, I never buy anything at retail prices. I used to own, X% of the entire Ethereum float kind of comments. People kind of soured on him. But prior to that, I think he said some brilliant things, back in the day. But I think he does have a good point again today on this. So with Zuckerberg's move to Florida, I don't know if people know about this yet, but that California billionaire tax idea backfired in the most spectacular fashion. Breaking: Mark Zuckerberg is buying a waterfront mansion in Miami, and Chamath is responding to that. California's total taxable wealth from billionaires has plummeted to well under 1 trillion from over 2 trillion just a few weeks ago. So think about that. Just because of this threatened tax on billionaires, they have lost over 1 trillion in taxable wealth. This is huge. This is a huge loss in tax base. This is basically the nightmare for any government. Governments spend years, decades trying to be attractive to capital. When you lose 1 trillion in capital, this is like losing a whole sector. This is crazy. Yeah, exactly. from the billionaire's perspective, it's exactly what Brown Beardo is saying here. What? No way. Who could have predicted this? Literally every single billionaire was like, I'm totally leaving if you do this. And of course, Newsom went ahead and did that. Now it's like Governor Gavin Newsom said he was working behind the scenes to block a proposed tax on billionaires' wealth and was committed to defeating the measure if it reached the ballot. Shocker. Now he's changed his mind. The loss of this tax revenue was totally avoidable, but is now forever, all because Gavin Newsom stood motionless as the stupidly written bill from a fringe union and a handful of socialist academics with an axe to grind meandered its way into the public conversation without any action from him and freaked everyone out. These were all people that were paying 13% plus in state income tax every year with no complaints until a few weeks ago. So for people outside the US who don't know, that's just their state tax. That's on top of the federal tax they're paying, which is much bigger. This is actually a very high state income tax. You might be comparing that in your head to like your national income tax. This is just for California. They pay their big tax to the federal government. So, and now for the rest of time, the lost tax revenues from these folks will have to be paid for by the middle class because they are the only group left in California large enough that you can tax to fill the hole. He's forsaken the middle class instead of managing the budget, managing the deficit, eliminating even a portion of California's gargantuan waste and abuse. He could have done any of these things at any point over the last 7+ years, but he was silent. And now California's budget will implode and he wants to run for president. So Matt says, sounds like the West Coast. Yep. You can only capture the poor via taxes. Very true. Well put, Frazek. So billionaires will always fucking move. Zuckerberg famously has bought his own island in Hawaii, and he's even willing to move as far as possible in the US from that island just to escape California taxes, right? Miami is like as far as possible. I guess you could argue, maybe we could say Maine is further, but Miami is about as far from his island as you could possibly move. And even that is preferable to paying those taxes. Troll Toll says, pray for us in California. Voter ID is a must over here. Yeah, that's another big topic. We'll see what happens on that. It seems like that's heating up. The voter ID thing is definitely heating up. Much like this continues to heat up. So in IR news, we see more of the same, basically. Breaking, President Trump said that if no deal is reached with Iran, the U.S. will take very tough action. He said he is weighing the deployment of an additional aircraft carrier to the region along with additional forces. So people thought this was going to be the George H.W. Bush carrier strike group. It's in the middle of CompTUX, which is, sort of like preparations and testing for deployment, off the Atlantic coast, sort of south and east of Norfolk, that he just sold out of. So people are actually saying if another carrier strike group goes to the Middle East, it's more likely to be the Gerald Ford carrier strike group. So we'll see if this actually happens. This is kind of just like a threat we've been waiting for Trump to make, that he adds a second aircraft carrier, right? Which sort of made sense because in the previous 12-day war strikes, we had one carrier strike group in the Eastern Mediterranean, one down, in the area that the Abraham Lincoln is currently in. So you would assume it would be the same setup if we were going to strike Iran again, which makes a lot of people think that any kind of kinetic activity like that might still be a ways off. But the U.S. is continuing to ship more air defense batteries to the region and all of those things. So it certainly looks like a buildup to a strike, but it's very gradual, very short. And, this is the first time even we're hearing about a possible second carrier being sent to the theater. So we'll see what it is. Here, even the posters down here are talking about the George H.W. Bush, but a lot of people, like I said, are counting that one out because apparently CompTUX for that carrier strike group is scheduled to go on for another like month or something. So we'll see what happens on this front. Okay. Okay, Idiot Clip says, does BTC dominance stay at 60% for 4 years? Is altcoin season was skipped? Yeah, I mean, I think at this point it's kind of interesting. This is something I think about every day. Was altcoin, what's going to happen? Basically, the question is, do we have to wait till 2029? I think we all have to mentally accept that it's possible, right? So you can hold out hope, and I'm sure every part of each of our brains is holding out hope that, the Clarity Act gets passed and we go back to the moon somehow. This is what we're all hoping. We're all hoping this could happen and happen soon. But I think we have to be open-minded and accept there's a possibility that we just got skipped. And, maybe we have to wait. Maybe we have to wait till 2029. There's a million different takes on this, million different approaches. Some people say it's, kind of like just a bad super cycle from now on. There is no more 4-year cycle. Liquidity is so messed up by the tariffs and everything going on, and Kevin Warsh is such a wild card thrown into this mix. Is it the scenario from the post we read yesterday where the US is going to do this wild thing like we did to Japan back in the 80s? Are we going to do that in 2026 to China? Is it going to be just this devaluing of the US dollar to force China to do the same thing that Japan did for decades after the 80s? Is that what's going on? There are too many variables at play right now. Like, I don't think anybody has a handle on what's coming, just like nobody predicted we were going to get skipped in 2025, right? I keep coming back to that. There's basically no predictive value of anything in crypto right now because, it was proven in 2025. Nobody knows what's going to happen. So I don't know. I wish we knew, but it sure feels like we got skipped. People often forget that California once was the conservative oasis. Yeah, the land of Reagan. Somehow they let the commies in and the commies destroyed it. Florida will go the same way someday if no one stays vigilant. I believe that is true. Yep. I believe that's true. Matt says, what a logistics nightmare working in harmony with Israeli IDF. Yep, Netanyahu is in Washington right now. There is a plan. There is sure a plan. For Bitcoin, it did work out pretty well. I think for Bitcoin, it kind of stayed intact. That's for sure true. It's just altcoins that seem to have gotten skipped. So much to the chagrin of all of us in Cardano, I think Bitcoins kind of did get skipped. So, the big hope, everybody's sort of like looking at this treasure chest, hoping, the White House forges a deal, gets the sledgehammer, walks up to that skull-shaped padlock, the deadlock, breaks it open with a sledgehammer, and, like a bunch of rainbow lasers fly out of the top of the case, and inside is regulatory clarity. It unlocks the markets, and we go back to the moon. That's the big hope. But we'll see. We'll see what actually happens. Yep. Yeah, it's kind of a fortuitous time for us to be talking about this because we're right back to where we were at the top of the last cycle. So it's kind of an interesting time to be talking about this. Ground zero. Yep, I would agree. This is kind of like ground zero. So the question is, so I think this has to happen. If we're not able to break the deadlock and open up the pirate chest here and get regulatory clarity, collect the regulatory clarity treasure. If we're not able to do that in the next few months before midterms, before we get too close to midterms even, then we might be screwed. We might be screwed for at least, basically until 2029. If we're able to get regulatory clarity, what happens then? Is it still just this gradual climb back up for a peak in 2029? Is it something sooner? Because we got skipped, do we have a chance at something sooner? Is it just a gradual climb forever? Is it a super cycle, but in slow motion forever? Not a super cycle, but because of the presence of the TradFi institutions, is it just going to be a traditional slow climb, just like orthodox equities and other assets now? Nobody really knows. Nobody really knows. But definitely, in my opinion, step one is breaking this deadlock, getting regulatory clarity. That's why I hope either our only hope really lies in one of two different possibilities. And that's that Coinbase pulls it off and they somehow get stablecoin yield, even passive stablecoin yield. I think that's unlikely. I think the best they get is yield on stablecoin activities. It's either that, some version of yield on stablecoin activities that makes Coinbase happy, along with A16Z and Kraken and everybody else, or Coinbase gives that up, throws in the towel and says, we'll get that later. I think that's the only two ways we get this before November. One of those two things. I don't think TradFi is going to come along and say, okay, we'll agree to roll over and die, right? Because yield on passive deposits would be death. That would be death to TradFi, right? The whole deposit business dies. They just roll over and die. If that happens, they're not going to do that. There's no scenario under which Jamie Dimon is like, okay, we'll give up the deposit yield business. We'll just give up on deposits. We just won't have people depositing in our banks anymore. That's not going to happen. It's probably, if we do get a compromise, it's probably going to be something around some very limited yield on stablecoin activities. So we'll see what we actually get. Cardano World says Trump will push hard. Yes, he will. I think he will. Still have not seen the tariff checks, the tax cuts. True. The Fed changed out. Yeah. But the problem is the wild card to me still is what people are pointing out. It's Kevin Warsh. Kevin Warsh is not a big QE guy. What I thought for sure, one of the things that I thought was going to be a given, and I think a lot of people thought was going to be a given, is that whoever ended up in Powell's chair was going to be a big liquidity guy or gal. We did not get that. Kevin Warsh is the opposite. So something is afoot, guys. The White House is up to something. It doesn't make sense they would put Kevin Warsh in there because he's not the guy you put in there if you're going to flush the system with liquidity. So if they're not going to flush the system with liquidity, they must have a completely different plan. So we'll see. I mean, Kevin Warsh was kind of a rug pull. Everybody was sort of banking on getting a big liquidity player in there. And instead, we got Kevin Warsh. So Kevin Warsh was kind of a rug pull. And I mean, the markets reacted negatively. Basent will conquer. I mean, that's a good point. Obviously, Basent is going to have a plan. Scott Basent is going to have a plan. And it's probably whatever his plan is probably the plan that the whole administration is going by. So I'm sure, I would have to guess that Kevin Warsh fits into that somehow. And maybe it's that let's do to China what we did to Japan in the 80s thing. Maybe that's the whole thing. Maybe they view this as super existential for the US. So maybe that's what it is. I don't know. Basent is Hercules. Kind of true. Basent is pretty tough. Basent is smart. He's very sharp and he's pretty tough. So he might as well be Hercules. Okay. I think we've covered all of the news for today, guys. Something big is afoot though. Something big is afoot. I think the Trump administration has some kind of a big economic plan. And maybe they're so scared about the debt, as they should be. Maybe this is like a big play to deal with the debt. Maybe that's what this is. Maybe that's why we got a Kevin Warsh. Maybe that's how they're going to deal with China. So I have a feeling over the next year or two, this is all going to become clear to us in retrospect. But right now, it's kind of misty. It's kind of foggy. So hopefully it turns out good for crypto. We shall see. I hope everybody is starting out a good week. I hope you're looking forward to a good rest of the week. And I will talk to you soon.